issue some things that were not covered and aren't in your packet. Hopefully you ladies can make it a few more minutes, can you? Okay. All righty. If you go back to this packet that I gave you guys, or will give you, look at the origin of the civil rights movement. Now, I've mentioned before how African Americans, when they returned, y'all, from World War II this time, they had fought for what was called the double V. Victory over fascism abroad, but victory over discrimination here. And a lot of them, y'all, were not really very happy with the situation when they got here. Now, a couple of important moments you should be aware of. Jackie Robinson is the first to break the color barrier. In other words, he is the first African American to play in the major leagues, to play in professional sports with whites integrated. Blacks had their own leagues, the so-called Negro leagues that had played. But Jackie played for the Brooklyn Dodgers, and you see a picture of him there. An incredible human being, his ability to endure all kinds of taunts and stuff, and a great ball player. I wish I could have seen him play. I was old enough, sadly, to hear about his death, but amazing. And he broke that barrier. Now, President Truman, the same year, Truman was a veteran, and when he heard that some African American soldiers had been beaten up, I think one even dying, if not more, he got a report issued called To Secure These Rights, calling for civil rights. And this was kind of amazing considering Truman was from a southern state, very conservative Democrat, y'all, that had not had the best track record in race. Then, of course, he did try to get some civil rights passed. It doesn't happen. But what Truman did do was he issued an executive order that would desegregate the armed forces. It took a while, but by the Korean War, we did have those, groups now being, merged together. And that was a major, major event. So remember, Truman desegregating the armed forces. We talked about Ford versus the Board of Education in 54, overturning Plessy versus Ferguson, overturning the idea of separate but equal. Instead, separate's inherently unequal. They mentioned the case of Sweat versus Painter. I may have that later in the PowerPoint. I think I do, but you should know this one. It's on your STAAR test. It involves UT, University of Texas, y'all. Sweat wanted to be, his name was He-Man. It says Herman, but I think it was pronounced He-Man. Sweat. He was an African-American, and he wanted to go to UT Law School. Well, basically, they said, you know what, we're not going to let you go. And the main reason, well, you're black. And so what University of Texas tried to do is they created a separate black law school at Texas State University. And it still is today. It's Thurgood Marshall School of Law right here in H-Town, Bayou City. And the Supreme Court basically ended up saying, look, that is not okay. Separate but equal. Those two law schools are not equal. And so that was a big, big case. And I'll even show you later on in Oklahoma, in McLaurin versus Oklahoma, they said, okay, we have to take a black guy, we'll take the black guy. But they made him sit outside of the class, y'all, in a separate desk and kept the door open. Made him sit separately at dinner. And, that's not accommodation. That's not equal or whatever. You can read at the very top here that about the Brown decision. Make sure, too, y'all, it says the Brown decision, and it mentions Earl Warren. Earl Warren had been a conservative. In fact, he ran for vice president with a Republican. And to everybody's surprise, he turned out to be a very, very activist. That is, shooting down a lot of laws, liberal judge. Surprised a lot of people. All right. Next, let's see here. Go to the next page. Okay. That next page doesn't talk about Emmett Till, but I don't think you can talk about civil rights and not talk about what happened to Emmett Till. Emmett Till, to many people, y'all, began the African-American civil rights movement. First of all, he was a kid living in Chicago. His mom and others had been part of the Great Migration, and they still had family in Mississippi. So it's summertime. He wants to go down and visit his cousins. He's 14 years old, and so he's going to go down to Mississippi by train. Before he goes, his mother says, look, it's different down there. You don't look at a white woman. You don't talk to them. You know, you say, yes, ma'am, yes, sir. You know, you don't talk back or anything like that. And a weird thing too, y'all, she gave him his ring. I mean, she gave him her husband's ring for him to put on. It had his father's name on it. His father had been executed during World War II. And he takes off his watch and he gives it to his mom and says, where I'm going, I'm not going to need this. Now, what ends up happening to him, they're out there, they've been playing, and there's a little store. And so his friends kind of urged him on. Allegedly, he showed them a picture of a girl, a white girl that he was going to school with, and maybe said, this is my girlfriend or whatever. You know, guys, sadly, how guys talk. And so his friends are like, oh, yeah? Well, why don't you go talk to that pretty white woman in there? And so he goes into the store, he buys some candy, and we're still not quite sure. Even the woman who's still alive has told different stories. He may have done a wolf whistle at her. Maybe he spoke to her when she gave him change. Some people think that when she gave him the change, he maybe, touched her hand or whatever. Maybe he even said, see you later, baby, which is one of the accusations. But she was a white married woman, and he bought the candy. All right. In the middle of the night, he was picked up, and he was kidnapped by some white men, taken to a barn, and beaten severely. He was tortured, and finally was shot to death, and his body thrown in a river. Now, when his body was found, it was so decomposed, y'all, that the only way they identified him was by his father's ring. He had been tied and sunk by a cotton gin fan in there. Now, he was buried. Body was in pretty bad shape, buried right there. Well, the mother, understandably, is like, hey, I would like to have my son's burial here in Chicago. And so they agreed, okay, we'll send the body back to you. But under no circumstances are you allowed to open up the casket. All right? It'll be too much for you to see. You can't do that. So the casket shows up in Chicago. Mrs. Till, Emmett's mom, obviously, Emmett Till, she demands. She said she'll do it herself. Open the casket. So they open it. They had to literally, it had been nailed shut and everything. Opens it, and then she sees the body. Now, one of his eyes was hanging loose. And I saw Mrs. Till speaking one time in an interview, and it breaks your heart. But what she said was she had to still herself to look at this. And what she did, she said she looked at her son, and he was nude, right, in the casket. And she started off at his feet. Well, the feet were okay. Making her way up. She came to his privates area. And she, embarrassed to see her son like that. But she noticed they hadn't done anything bad to his sexual organs, which was amazing because that was often, sadly, something that might be done. But then made his way to his face where it was obvious he'd been beaten. An eye was hanging on his cheek. His head had been split open. He'd been shot. Okay? Now, of course, they said, all right, well, we'll close it up. We'll get it ready for the funeral. And she's like, no, we will have the body on display so people can see. So what they did is they shut the coffin with glass. It was quite awful to see. They dressed him in a suit, and they let people see it. Now, thousands came to the funeral, but even more important, y'all, was that pictures were taken and ended up in a predominantly African-American magazine called Jet Magazine. And there you see them posing. She's with her second husband. They're posing with him. And you see the picture of her with her son and then what he looked like after this, y'all. And many people, y'all, said this is when they got involved in the civil rights movement. It's one thing to kill adults, as bad as that is, but it's especially worse, like I mentioned, with those 4 little girls that were blown up in the Birmingham 16th Street church bombing in September '63. But this was so much worse. All right, you guys, and of course, and what made it worse, y'all, was the 3 guys said they didn't do it, even though there were witnesses. In the trial in those days, only white men could judge white men, right? And all of them were found innocent. And later, they even got money for publishing in a magazine that they had done it. And there you see them with their wives, all but Miss Bryant. This lady right here, all of them are dead now. And there's actually been talk of reopening it, but hey, most of the people are long dead. This is the building where he went in there, Bryant's Grocery. This is what it looks like today. Kind of fallen on some bad times. There's Mrs. Bryant back in the day. This is her today. She lives in a trailer, and sometimes people come by and try to get her to talk about it. There. Okay, you've already seen the Rosa Parks. We've gone through and talked about that. You know, I'm going to go through this kind of fast because you have the reading and you saw it in the video. Okay, the Little Rock High School. Okay, so you see the Little Rock 9. I think 7 of the kids are still around. There you hear the description about Orville Faubus, the governor who tried to make this into a political issue and got the National Guards. There you see Liz Eckfort's showing up, being attacked. Okay, you see the lady like yelling at her. Eisenhower sends the National Guard in to escort the students. And then, and this I forgot to say, y'all, but a lot of people think, okay, well, it was all fixed. They sent these kids to, you know, into the school, and we all lived happily ever after. The next year, y'all, Arkansas shut down their schools. You could not go to school. Basically, it was, if you're going to force us to send these kids to school, we are not going to go to school with them. Instead, white kids sent their, they opened up private schools, which could discriminate and pick who they wanted to go, or they called them academies. Now, they don't mention this, but this was in the video. This is the first sit-in. This is in North Carolina. I really admire these guys. 2 of them are still alive today. They were just college students. They weren't part of any organization. They just saw something wrong, and they wanted to fix it. Now, blacks could buy food at the lunch counter, but they could not sit down at the lunch counter to eat it. And that's what they did. They sat down there, and they weren't served. They were ignored for some time, and finally cops came and tried to get them to leave. The next day, more and more people, including a girls' college, came by. And eventually, y'all, the store opened the counter to everybody. And this inspires a lot more of these sit-ins throughout the South. And it started with just 4 college kids trying to do something to fix things. All right. Now, the Woolsworth today is still there where this happened. It's been converted into a museum, a civil rights museum. It wasn't open when I went there to visit. They were still working on it. My wife said, "Are you not going to go in? Just because, I mean, you came this far." I was visiting the area. "You came this far and you're not going to go to this museum?" And I said, "They told me I couldn't. I called. They won't let me in." She said, "You're really going to give up. You're not going to try." That's my wife, y'all. I find reasons why I can't do stuff. My wife finds reasons why you can do stuff. So I did show up, and I went over to the little wooden door here, right? And I kind of knocked on it. There was one worker, one dude was working in there. And I told him my story. "Hey, I'm a history teacher." At the time, I was teaching a class just on the 60s. I said, "I really admire these young men. Is there any way I could come in and just get a peek at this place?" I said, "This is like really historic holy ground for me." And he said, "Sure." And so we came in, and there's the lunch counter, and he pulled back the cover over it. And I go, "Oh, man." I mean, I get chills now, still just talking about it. And he goes, "There it is." I'm like, "Let me take a picture. This is awesome. Thank you so much, sir." And then he goes, "Why don't you take a seat there?" And there I am. And, you know, all 200 pounds of me. And I tell you, y'all, it was so cool. I'm literally sitting there in history. Today, of course, that area is all marked off. You can't get to do it. But to sit there where those men changed history, y'all, that's, you just can't buy that. You just can't. And it's still one of my big moments. We saw the Freedom Riders, right, that tried to desegregate the buses that came down here. One of them was one of the guys featured in the Great Debaters. These buses, y'all, made their way down, and when they got to Alabama, and this is a picture you guys need to be able to recognize. You could see it on an AP test. When they came into Anniston, Alabama, one of the buses was hit with knives. They stabbed the tires, and the bus driver took off. And eventually, the tires ran out of air, and a car showed up, y'all, and they smashed a window. And I kid you not, they threw a firebomb in there, right, trying to burn these people alive. They even tried to hold the door shut so they couldn't get out. Fortunately, some good cops showed up, and they chased these guys away, and they got the people out. Let's see, do I have any pictures of the bus? Yeah, there's the buses. That's what you might see on an AP test. That is the Freedom Riders having one of their two buses being burned, a Greyhound bus. The other bus members, y'all, were beaten quite badly. Jim Swerd was left disfigured. James Peck was beaten pretty badly. And the thing is, what this did was it encouraged others. And President Kennedy, who had promised to do more for civil rights, he'd helped get Dr. King out of jail at one point. He finally was forced to do something. And this time, the guys and gals, because the first one were all guys, but then guys and gals like Diane Nash here, who's still alive, by the way, Diane Nash and others would be escorted and protected. Now, this is James Meredith, who I mentioned was the first African-American to go to the University of Mississippi. Eventually, when John F. Kennedy, President Kennedy, now having to do something about civil rights, got him admitted, but then riots happened. There's James Meredith, also still alive today, okay? He graduated a year later, but there were riots. It got really, really awful. So that was the integration of that school. There you see the federal marshals accompanying him. Nobody would talk to him at lunch. They gave him a ground floor dorm, and during the night, the people above took turns bouncing a basketball to keep him awake. There's the governor who fought it as hard as he could. He was undergoing a re-election and scandal. Like I said, a lot of these governors use this as a wedge issue and that kind of thing. Now here's, wrong George Wallace. That's the comedian. Okay, here's the right George Wallace. He is the guy who basically had claimed that he had been not strong enough on segregation. It had kept him from winning the election. He actually used that phrase that included the N-word. And so he decided in '63 to be a strict segregationist. And at his inauguration, he said these infamous words. In the name of the greatest people who've ever trod the earth, I draw the line in the dust, toss the gauntlet of freedom, tyranny, and I say, this is the line to remember, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. And so when they chose to try to integrate next the University of Alabama, he made his stand in the schoolhouse door, right? Tried to keep these two students from getting in there, okay? And I'll show you some pictures here. There you see Wallace. This is the Attorney General Katzenbach, basically ordering him to move. They had to deputize and take over the Army. There you see the commander telling him, and he actually said these words: "It is my sad duty to inform you that you must move," and basically saying, we are under the command of the president. And Wallace said, okay, I'll leave. Now, this will get Wallace a lot of fame, and in 1968, he will run as an independent, getting a lot of support, possibly costing the Democrats the election and getting Richard Nixon elected president. And then in 1972, he's running again. And I remember as a kid, we were in Washington, D.C., not too far away. And on the radio, it came out that he had been shot and badly wounded. Turned out he'd spend the rest of his life in a wheelchair, trying to, campaign and get elected. This is also the scene, if you guys have ever seen Forrest Gump, that Forrest is supposedly standing back here And when Vivian Malone tries to get in, she drops a book and he runs over and he picks it up and gives it to her. Okay, there you see Vivian entering and going to school. Okay. All righty. The Birmingham campaign, most people we went after Birmingham, or the civil rights leaders did, because it was the most segregated school. Even King got arrested. Remember, that's where he wrote his famous letter from a Birmingham jail. And then the decision was used to use children. Bull Connor, that's a name you hear some people saying even to this day, there he is, used attack dogs, water hoses, which got national attention to the case. Here you see Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail, right? The wait has almost always meant never. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. He wrote it on toilet paper, y'all, or on the margin of newspapers, because he wasn't allowed to have like writing paper. Justice too long delayed is justice denied. And of course, Kennedy then used that Birmingham, or not the Birmingham, the schoolhouse door speech by Wallace to give a support to civil rights. And Mississippi Civil Rights Medgar Evers was gunned down. I mentioned him. Very, very brave man who has been forgotten by a lot of people in the civil rights movement. He was literally returning home, and he had shirts that said, "Jim Crow must go," right? And he walked out, and literally, y'all, he was shot and killed on his own driveway. And there's his grave today. And it took a third trial in 1994 for the shooter. And pretty much everybody knew this guy was guilty, but for the shooter to be killed, or to be named, and eventually he died in prison a few years ago. And it's interesting enough, his middle name was Delay, and you could definitely say justice was delayed in this case. I mentioned the 4 little girls. Here's the 16th Street Baptist Church. It had been a key organizing point, and was one of the centers. 22 people were injured by the bomb. There you see like a car. I mean, pretty devastating bomb. There you see the side. More damage because they threw the bomb down in that kind of doorway there. And 4 little girls. There they are. Let's see. 4 little girls were killed as a result. And it wasn't, y'all, until the 90s that these guys were prosecuted as well, too. All right. One of them actually had a website in jail where he maintained he was innocent. Now, the Freedom Summer, right? They went to try to register African Americans to vote. These 3 civil rights workers were arrested for supposedly speeding. They were let go, but then they disappeared. The FBI eventually was able to determine where they were, where the 3 men are. They got not guilty verdicts, and it took years before finally, there you see the 3 bodies inside the earthen dam. Like I said, they've been beaten. Then we see the Selma to Montgomery marches, right? After Jimmy Lee Jackson had been killed. Remember, the first march is the Bloody Sunday March. The second march is when Dr. King leads people over the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And even in that, nearby there was a white minister who was attacked, who was supportive of it, died a couple of days. The third march, y'all, successfully reached, I guess I ran out of typing there, Montgomery, okay? And, reached the Capitol, okay? And so, all right, make sure you know the Civil Rights Act of 1964, passed by President Johnson, barred discrimination in public accommodations. We mentioned that already, but it did include women. The Selma March, y'all, and the Freedom Summer and the murder of the 3 civil rights workers also played a big role in Voting Rights Act of 65. This made it illegal to have, literacy tests. Eventually, poll taxes would be ended by an amendment, and it made it a lot easier for African Americans to finally be able to vote. In 1968, there's also a Fair Housing Act to decrease the amount of discrimination in housing, okay? Now, as you saw in the video, there were a series of people that got very impatient at the progress that this was happening. And in 1965, there was a series of rioting in Los Angeles, the so-called Watts riots, the long hot summer, as some people called it. Okay, you see affirmative action mentioned there as well. Okay, let's see here. A lot of damage, $40 million, and it's also we get the famous phrase "burn, baby, burn." And we see this has happened again. You know, like for example, you guys weren't alive for the Rodney King protest in LA, but Rodney King was an African American motorist who had led the police on a high speed run. Yeah, hey, yeah, awesome. Let me get this for you. I'm going to post it up here in a little bit. And we watched the video. Let me get you a copy of that as well. They went ahead and ran Great Depression off for a third time. And here is and you can get one too, Jay. I kind of talked my way through the video. I don't know if the video sound is going to come through, but I'll post the video just in case as well. Did I get you some more? All right, thank you all for coming by. All right. So in 1965, I was talking about Rodney King. So in the 1990s, y'all, Rodney King was a motorist who got stopped by the cops after a high-speed chase. He resisted arrest. He struck back at the cops, but the cops then began to beat him, and they didn't stop. Now, midway through it, a person across the way, a man by the name of Holiday, began to film it with a video recorder. Those were pretty big back then. And when shown, the cops looked like they had gone way out of control. Now, when the case was heard, the people, the jury said these cops had not acted out of it. Now, it was a predominantly white jury, and the cops were found not guilty. Later, they would be charged for violation of the civil rights. That'd be different. But African Americans in Los Angeles burned a lot of the city down. And you guys are old enough, of course, to remember the George Floyd protest, which actually happened in a lot more places where you had similar incidents of anger and people, burning and destroying things as a result as well, too. So a lot of this goes back in there. Now, as I said, many African Americans became frustrated. Sorry about the spelling there. Some urged black nationalism like Marcus Garvey had, separatism. You can see, y'all, I still got a lot of work to do on this one. Oh, this is important. Okay, in 1968 at the Olympic Games, these two African Americans, one who had finished first, one who finished third, borrowed the running gloves of this Australian runner. And when the national anthem was played, they gave the fist the Black Power salute. And as a result, they didn't lose their medals, I don't think, but they were barred from the Olympic Games. That proved to be very controversial because a lot of people thought you shouldn't be using these games. Boy, I misspelled Dave there. Stokely Carmichael, y'all, had used the first to use the term Black Power. It happened after James Meredith, the man who'd integrated University of Mississippi, was shot during a protest in the legs, and he talked about Black Power. What we're going to start saying now is Black Power. He and Huey Newton formed that group you saw in the video, the Black Panther group. They armed themselves publicly. They went around with shotguns and rifles. They patrolled their communities. They tried to protect themselves against police violence toward them, educated people, free breakfast, stuff like that. And ultimately, because a lot of them were supportive of communism, they became a major target of the FBI, and this is J. Edgar Hoover. And yes, that's right, y'all. The same J. Edgar Hoover that I mentioned back during World War I had helped round up radicals and anarchists. Here it is, y'all, the 60s and 70s, and that dude was still in power. Okay, let's see here if there's anything else on this. Affirmative action, 1965, okay. Okay, we talked about that, how that worked. Also, too, y'all, it mentions that case I was talking about there, Bakey versus University of California Board of Regents, where basically they said, look, you can't be using these racial quotas. This is, you can't discriminate this way. You can't do reverse discrimination to make up for things. Ultimately, although not initially, as this kind of suggests, the Reverend Billy Graham. Now, this is something on your STAAR test, but not likely to be on your AP test. Graham was an important supporter, ultimately, of the as a white minister and preacher. He appealed to a lot of people. He wasn't, I think he himself was Baptist, but he could appeal to almost all Christians, and even non-Christians could hear in his sermons. And he went all over the world, even to the Soviet Union, and preached there, even though he was an anti-communist. But he was an opponent of segregation. He helped bail out Dr. King. He also, when Eisenhower called to ask him some questions, he supported Eisenhower's decision to help support those Little Rock Nine. And so there you see him. And he just passed away a couple of years ago. He either lived to be 100 or he got doggone close to it. Hey, man, we've been here for like 4 wonderful hours. Isn't this awesome? I can just see y'all. Y'all are like brain dead, like, Mr. D, come help me get out of my seat. I can't move. I think I've grown roots here. Help me. Help me, Obi-Wan. You're my only hope. All right, we're going to stop there. All right. Woo! This is awesome. I am so happy. All right, let's go here. Let's close this baby.